The moment Pope Leo XIV called Jonathan Roumie's name in front of 50,000 stunned pilgrims, the actor, who portrayed Jesus, knew his life was about to change forever. His hands trembled as the Holy Father's voice boomed across St. Peter's Square, singling him out from the massive crowd with words that would soon make headlines worldwide. Security guards immediately escorted him toward the papal platform, while thousands of phones captured every step through the parted crowd. The morning air felt electric as Jonathan climbed the steps, his heart pounding with the realization that this was no ordinary papal audience. What the Pope was about to ask him would leave an entire generation of believers weeping with joy. As Jonathan reached the platform, Pope Leo XIV's eyes held a depth of purpose that made it clear this encounter had been divinely orchestrated. The crowd fell into absolute silence, sensing they were about to witness something unprecedented in Vatican history. Jonathan's humble demeanor stood in stark contrast to the grandeur surrounding him. His presence commanded the attention of every soul present. The Pope stepped forward with an intensity that made even the Swiss guards lean in closer, knowing their pontiff was about to reshape modern Christianity. The next few minutes would prove that God still calls ordinary people to extraordinary purposes in ways that defy all human expectation. My dear friend Jonathan, Pope Leo XIV said into the microphone, his voice carrying across the square with remarkable clarity, I have been watching your work, and I believe God has given you a special gift. The Pope's English was accented, but perfectly clear, and his words seemed to embrace Jonathan like a father welcoming home a beloved son. Jonathan bowed respectfully, unsure whether to speak or simply listen. As the massive crowd fell into complete silence, the morning breeze carried the scent of incense from the nearby basilica, creating an atmosphere of sacred anticipation. Jonathan had arrived in Rome just 3 days earlier for what was supposed to be a quiet pilgrimage with a small group of fellow actors from The Chosen. He'd been filming the final season of the series that had touched millions of lives worldwide, and the emotional weight of portraying Jesus had left him seeking deeper spiritual renewal. The group had planned simple visits to holy sites, private masses, and time for reflection. Away from the demands of their growing fame, none of them had expected to receive a personal invitation to the Pope's weekly general audience, much less this unprecedented moment on the papal stage. Jonathan's hands trembled slightly as he stood before the successor of St. Peter, feeling the weight of history and the presence of the Holy Spirit. Your portrayal of our Lord has brought many souls closer to Christ. The Pope continued, his voice filled with genuine appreciation. But today, I want to speak with you not as an actor, but as a man of faith. Jonathan nodded, feeling tears already forming in his eyes at the unexpected honor of this recognition. The crowd began to murmur with excitement, many recognizing the significance of this papal endorsement of the series that had revolutionized how people experience the Gospels. Camera crews from Vatican media moved closer, sensing they were witnessing something that would be remembered for generations. The Pope gestured for Jonathan to come closer, and as he did, the Holy Father placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Tell me, my son, what has this journey taught you about following Jesus? The Pope asked, his voice soft enough that the microphones barely caught it, creating an intimate moment within the vast public setting. Jonathan took a deep breath, knowing that his answer would be heard by thousands in the square and millions more watching the live stream around the world. The weight of representing not just himself, but every person who had found hope through The Chosen pressed upon his heart. He thought of the countless letters from fans who had rediscovered their faith, the testimonies of healing and conversion, the children who now saw Jesus as a friend rather than a distant figure. Your Holiness, Jonathan began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, this role has taught me that Jesus isn't just a character to portray. He's a living person who walks with us every day. The simplicity of his words carried a profound truth that resonated through the square like ripples on water. Many in the crowd nodded, their own hearts stirring as they remembered their personal encounters with Christ through the series. The Pope smiled, his eyes bright with approval. He sensed the authenticity in Jonathan's response. Vatican officials on the platform exchanged meaningful glances, recognizing they were witnessing a moment of genuine spiritual significance. What the crowd didn't know was that 3 nights earlier, Jonathan had experienced a profound spiritual crisis in his hotel room overlooking the Tiber River. The pressure of embodying Jesus on screen had led him to question whether he was worthy of such a calling, whether his own struggles and doubts made him a fraud. He had spent hours in prayer, wrestling with feelings of inadequacy and the fear that he was somehow diminishing the sacred by portraying it. The darkness of that night had been broken only by a deep sense that God was calling him to something greater than acting. Now standing before the Pope, he felt that mysterious calling beginning to unfold in ways he never could have imagined. I have watched episodes of your series, Pope Leo the Puritan shared his confession, drawing gasps of delight from the crowd. "What strikes me most is how you show Jesus as both fully divine and fully human." Laughing with his friends, feeling tired, experiencing joy, the Pope's endorsement sent waves of excitement through the thousands gathered, many of whom had traveled from across the globe specifically because the chosen had deepened their faith. Jonathan felt overwhelmed by the realization that the successor of St. Peter had taken time to watch their humble production. The validation was more than professional, it was deeply spiritual, confirming that their work was indeed serving God's purposes. The Pope then did something completely unexpected that would become the defining moment of the encounter. He asked Jonathan to kneel, not in submission, but in prayer, and invited the entire crowd to join them in a moment of silent reflection. 50 people dropped to their knees on the ancient stones of St. Peter's Square as the Pope placed his hands on Jonathan's head in blessing. The silence was profound, broken only by the gentle cooing of doves and the distant sound of church bells. From across Rome, in that sacred pause, many felt the presence of Christ in a way they had never experienced before, as if the boundary between heaven and earth had grown thin. As they prayed together, Jonathan felt a supernatural peace wash over him, dissolving the doubts and fears that had plagued him for months. The Pope whispered a blessing in Latin, his words carrying the weight of 20 years of apostolic succession. When they stood, both men had tears in their eyes, and the crowd could sense that something profound had just taken place. If you believe God still calls ordinary people to extraordinary purposes like he called Jonathan, comment the word "Amen" below. Vatican photographers captured the image of the Pope and the actor embracing a picture that would grace the covers of Catholic publications worldwide. "My dear Jonathan," the Pope said, his voice carrying new warmth and authority, "I want to ask you something." Before all these witnesses, the crowd leaned forward, collectively sensing that whatever came next would be significant beyond their current understanding. Jonathan nodded, his heart open and ready to receive whatever calling God might place before him. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting the entire scene in golden light that seemed almost supernatural. Even the Vatican Swiss guards, trained to maintain stoic composure, appeared moved by the unfolding drama. The backstory of how this moment came to be was itself a testament to divine providence working through unexpected channels. 2 weeks earlier, Cardinal Joseph Martelli, the Pope's secretary, had been recovering from a minor illness in his Vatican apartment when his nephew visited from Milan. The young man, a devoted fan of The Chosen, had brought his tablet to show his uncle clips from the series, hoping to lift the cardinal's spirits. As Cardinal Martelli watched Jonathan's portrayal of Jesus teaching the Sermon on the Mount, he was struck by something. He couldn't quite articulate, a sense that this actor was doing more than performing. He was serving. The cardinal made a note to mention the series to the Holy Father during their next private meeting. That conversation between the cardinal and Pope Leo XIV had taken place just days before Jonathan's arrival in Rome. During one of their regular evening walks in the Vatican gardens holy morning, he shows Jesus not as a distant God, but as Emmanuel, God with us. It was then that the Holy Father decided to extend a personal invitation for Jonathan and his fellow cast members to attend the general audience, though he kept his larger plans to himself. Now standing before this massive crowd, the Pope was ready to reveal the inspiration that had come to him during his private prayer time. "Jonathan," he said, "I have seen how your work has opened hearts to Christ all over the world. But I believe God is calling you to something even greater." The actor's eyes widened with curiosity and perhaps a touch of apprehension, wondering what could be greater than the privilege of portraying Jesus. The crowd sensed the gravity of the moment, many holding their breath as they waited for the Pope's next words. Vatican officials, who had been briefed on the Pope's plans, watched with anticipation, knowing they were about to witness church history in the making. The Pope reached into his white cassock and withdrew a small, simple wooden cross, aged and weathered with time. This cross belonged to St. Francis of Assisi. He announced, his words sending a shock wave through the assembled pilgrims. "Is the same cross before which he prayed when Christ spoke to him, saying, 'Francis, rebuild my church.'" Jonathan's knees nearly buckled as he realized the historical and spiritual significance of the relic being placed in his hands. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented in modern papal history. Never before had a pope given such a sacred relic to an actor, and the implications of the gesture were staggering. "I am not giving this to you as an actor," the Pope clarified, his voice rising with passion and authority. "I am giving this to you as an apostle of our time, called to rebuild faith in a world that has forgotten how to hope." The words hit Jonathan like lightning, and he felt his knees give way as he knelt again before the vicar of Christ. The crowd gasped collectively, many beginning to weep, as they witnessed what felt like a modern-day commissioning of a disciple. The Pope's use of the word apostle was not lost on anyone present. It was a title reserved for the most sacred callings, and its application to a Hollywood actor was revolutionary. As Jonathan held the cross of St. Francis, he felt a warmth spreading through his hands and into his heart as if centuries of prayer and devotion were flowing into his soul. The relic seemed to pulse with spiritual energy, connecting him to an unbroken chain of saints and martyrs who had carried the gospel to the ends of the earth. Tears streamed down his face as he realized that his journey from struggling actor to playing Jesus had been preparation for this moment, this calling that transcended entertainment and entered the realm of true ministry. The crowd watched in reverent silence as their hearts opened to witness what could only be described as a modern miracle unfolding before their eyes. The Pope continued his address, speaking now, not just to Jonathan, but to the entire world. Watching this unprecedented moment in every generation, God raises up voices to speak his truth in the language of their time. He declared today that language is film and television, and God has chosen this man to be his voice. The implications of the Pope's words rippled through Catholic communities worldwide as news of the event spread rapidly across social media and news networks. Religious leaders from various denominations began weighing in on the significance of a pope commissioning an actor for apostolic ministry. The boundaries between entertainment and evangelization were being redrawn in real time. Jonathan found his voice speaking into the microphone with a clarity that surprised even himself. Your Holiness, I am unworthy of such an honor, but if God is truly calling me to this mission, then I accept with all my heart. His words carried across the square with the force of a prophetic declaration, and many in the crowd felt the Holy Spirit moving in their own hearts. The simplicity and humility of his response only confirmed to those watching that they were witnessing a genuine calling rather than a publicity stunt. Vatican correspondents began filing reports that would dominate headlines for weeks, trying to capture the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. The Pope smiled warmly and placed both hands on Jonathan's shoulders. Then let me pray over you, the prayer that Christ prayed over his apostles, he said, beginning to recite words that had not been spoken in such a context for nearly 2,000 years. The Latin phrases flowed over the crowd like a benediction, and many felt transported back to the upper room where Jesus first commissioned his disciples. Even those who didn't understand the ancient language could feel the power and authority in the Pope's voice. He called down the blessing of heaven upon this unlikely apostle. The moment transcended denominational boundaries as Christians around the world recognized the historical significance of what was taking place. As the prayer concluded, something extraordinary happened that no one had planned or could have predicted. A gentle breeze began to blow across the square, carrying with it the scent of roses, despite the fact that no roses were in bloom in St. Peter's Square that day. Many in the crowd later testified to the supernatural fragrance, a phenomenon often associated with the presence of saints and miraculous interventions. Jonathan felt the wind on his face and knew in his heart that this was God's confirmation of the calling placed upon his life. The Pope's eyes twinkled with joy. He too recognized the divine sign, and he whispered to Jonathan, Saint Tears is pleased with our work today. The crowd began to sing spontaneously, their voices joining together in a Maria. As the reality of what they had witnessed began to sink in, Jonathan stood with the ancient cross clutched to his chest, feeling the weight of history and the likeness of grace simultaneously. The Pope remained beside him, occasionally placing a fatherly hand on his back, as if to steady him for the journey ahead. Vatican security had long since given up trying to maintain strict protocols, recognizing that they were presiding over a moment that would be remembered long after all of them had passed into eternity. The singing grew louder and more beautiful as voices from dozens of nations joined together in praise. What made this moment even more remarkable was the complete absence of any advanced publicity or scripting. The Pope had shared his plans only with his closest advisors, wanting the event to unfold naturally, without the artificial pressure of media expectations. Jonathan had attended the general audience expecting to be merely another face in the crowd, perhaps hoping for a distant glimpse of the Holy Father. Instead, he found himself at the center of what religious historians would later describe as one of the most significant papal actions of the modern era. The authenticity of the surprise was evident in Jonathan's genuine emotional response and the spontaneous reaction of the crowd. As the singing continued, the Pope gestured for silence and addressed the crowd one final time. What you have witnessed today is not about one man or one television series, he proclaimed. It is about God's desire to reach every heart in every corner of the world through whatever means will speak to them most clearly. His words provided the theological framework for understanding why a pope would commission an actor as an apostle. It wasn't about entertainment, but about evangelization. The crowd erupted in sustained applause, recognizing the wisdom and courage it had taken for the Holy Father to break with tradition in service of the gospel. Religious scholars watching the live stream began immediately trust and support of the Holy Father, the cross of St. Francis seemed to grow warmer in his hands as he contemplated what new calling might be about to unfold in his life. The crowd began to disperse slowly, many lingering to process what they had experienced and to share their reactions with fellow pilgrims. Clusters of people formed spontaneous prayer circles throughout the square, their hearts too full to simply walk away from such a sacred moment. Jonathan remained on the platform with the Pope and his entourage still holding the precious relic and trying to comprehend how his life had just changed forever. Vatican photographers captured final images of the two men in conversation, the Pope's animated gestures suggesting he was already sharing ideas for Jonathan's expanded ministry. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ancient stones, marking the end of an ordinary day that had become extraordinary. In the days leading up to this moment, Jonathan had been struggling with questions about the future of The Chosen and his own calling as an actor. The final season was nearly complete, and he wondered what God might have in store for him beyond the series that had defined his career and spiritual journey. He had been praying for clarity about his next steps, asking God to show him how to continue serving the gospel in whatever way would be most fruitful. The Pope's unexpected commission provided an answer to prayers he hadn't even known how to formulate, opening doors to possibilities he had never imagined. As they prepared to leave the platform, the Pope whispered something to Jonathan that only he could hear, words that would sustain him through the challenges ahead. Remember, my son, that you are not carrying this cross alone. You are joining a communion of saints who have carried it before you. The private words of encouragement strengthened Jonathan's resolve and reminded him that his new calling connected him to 2 years of faithful witnesses. The weight of the relic in his hands no longer felt burdensome, but empowering, a tangible reminder of the prayers and sacrifices of countless believers who had paved the way for this moment. He nodded to the Pope with deep gratitude, knowing that this brief encounter had changed not just his own life, but potentially the lives of millions who would hear his testimony. The impact of the day's events continued to reverberate as Jonathan returned to his hotel. That evening, fellow cast members from The Chosen gathered in his room to pray and process what had happened, their own hearts moved by witnessing their friend receive such an extraordinary calling. They knelt together around the cross of St. Francis, each taking turns to pray for Jonathan and for the ministry that God was unfolding through their series. The small wooden cross seemed to radiate peace throughout the room, blessing not just Jonathan, but everyone who came into contact with it. Their prayers continued late into the night as they sought wisdom for how to integrate this new reality into their ongoing work. Social media continued to buzz with reactions from around the world, with many sharing personal testimonies of how The Chosen had impacted their faith. Religious leaders from various denominations weighed in on the significance of the Pope's actions, with most expressing support for innovative approaches to evangelization in the digital age. The hashtag #Apostle began trending globally as people shared clips from the encounter and reflected on its meaning for modern Christianity. Critics and supporters alike recognized that something unprecedented had occurred, regardless of their theological perspectives on the appropriateness of the Pope's decision. Meanwhile, in his private chapel that evening, Pope Leo XIV knelt before a crucifix and prayed for Jonathan, asking God to strengthen him for the mission ahead. The Holy Father felt profound peace about his decision, knowing that it had come from deep prayer and consultation with the Holy Spirit. He thought about the great missionary saints of the past, Francis Xavier, Terz of Lisieux, Maximilian Kolbe, and how each had used the tools of their time to spread the gospel. In Jonathan Roumie, he saw a modern missionary equipped with the powerful tools of contemporary media, ready to carry Christ's message to places traditional evangelization could never reach. The next morning brought hundreds of interview requests from major news networks, religious publications, and international media outlets, all seeking to understand the full significance of what had transpired. Jonathan spent time in prayer before the cross of St. Francis, asking for wisdom about how to handle the sudden global attention while remaining faithful to his new calling. He felt the weight of responsibility, but also the joy of knowing that God had equipped him for this moment through years of preparation. He was only now beginning to understand the private audience with the Pope. Later that day would provide further direction for how to proceed with this unexpected expansion of his ministry. As word of the papal commission spread throughout the entertainment industry, colleagues and friends reached out to express their amazement and support. Many fellow actors shared their own stories of how The Chosen had impacted their personal faith journeys, revealing the profound spiritual influence the series had already been having behind the scenes in Hollywood. Industry executives began reconsidering the commercial potential of faith-based content, recognizing that the Pope's endorsement represented a seismic shift in how religious entertainment might be received by global audiences. The entertainment world was beginning to understand that they had witnessed not just a religious event, but a cultural transformation with very-acting implications that evening as Jonathan prepared for his private audience with the Pope the following day. He spent time reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment, from his early struggles as an actor in New York to the unexpected opportunity to portray Jesus. Every step now seemed part of a divine plan that was only beginning to unfold. He held the cross of St. Francis close to his heart. He prayed, feeling the presence of the saint who had heard Christ's call to rebuild his church 7 centuries earlier. Tomorrow would bring new revelations about his expanded calling, but tonight he simply rested in the profound peace of knowing that God had chosen him for something greater than he had ever imagined possible. The private audience the following morning took place in the Pope's personal study, a small humble room filled with books and simple wooden furniture that reflected the Holy Father's commitment to simplicity. Jonathan entered carrying the cross of St. Francis, which he had kept with him through the night, finding comfort in its tangible connection to centuries of faithful service. Pope Leo XIV greeted him warmly, offering him coffee and bread in a gesture of hospitality that immediately put Jonathan at ease. The morning light streaming through the window seemed to bless their conversation as the Pope began to unfold the vision that God had given him for Jonathan's future. Down his face as he realized that God had not only called him to this ministry, but had already begun preparing the infrastructure to support it. The cross in his hands seemed to grow warm. He contemplated the incredible privilege and responsibility of such a calling, but the most stunning revelation was yet to come. The Pope leaned forward and spoke words that would echo through church history. Jonathan, I am not just asking you to direct this new pontifical council, I am asking you to be ordained as a permanent deacon, so that you can serve the Church with the full authority of holy orders. The room fell silent as the magnitude of this proposal settled over both men. Jonathan had never considered religious ordination, having always seen his calling as that of a lay evangelist, but the Pope's words carried the unmistakable weight of divine inspiration. The possibility of being ordained while continuing his media ministry represented a completely new model of clerical service that would bridge the ancient traditions of the Church with the realities of modern communication. Through his tears, Jonathan found his voice and spoke words that would be remembered as one of the most beautiful expressions of surrender in modern church history. Holy Father, if this is truly God's will, then I accept this calling with all my heart, knowing that I am unworthy, but trusting that His grace will make me sufficient. The simplicity and humility of his response moved the Pope to tears, and both men knelt together in prayer as the Holy Spirit filled the small study with an almost tangible presence. Outside the windows, the bells of St. Peter's began to ring the hour, as if heaven itself were celebrating this moment of divine calling and human acceptance. The cross of St. Francis, now held between their joined hands, seemed to radiate the same supernatural warmth that St. Francis himself had experienced when Christ called him to rebuild the Church. As they rose from prayer, Pope Leo XIV embraced Jonathan with the warmth of a father blessing his son, and both men knew that they had just participated in something that would reshape the future of Catholic evangelization. The Pope explained that the formal announcement of the new Pontifical Council and Jonathan's ordination would be made during the upcoming World Communications Day, giving them time to prepare the groundwork and ensure that this revolutionary approach would have the strongest possible foundation. Jonathan felt overwhelmed with gratitude. He realized that God had orchestrated every detail of his journey, from his early struggles as an actor to his role in The Chosen to this moment of extraordinary calling. The weight of responsibility was immense, but so was the joy of knowing that he would spend the rest of his life serving the gospel in ways he never could have imagined. The Pope presented Jonathan with a special edition of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, inscribed with a personal blessing and the words for the new apostle of the digital age, "May your ministry bear fruit that lasts for eternity." As Jonathan held both the ancient cross of St. Francis and the modern catechism, he felt the beautiful continuity between past and future that characterizes the eternal Church. Their private audience concluded with the Pope's promise of ongoing support and guidance as Jonathan prepared for ordination and the establishment of the new Pontifical Council. The Holy Father's final words were spoken with prophetic authority: "Go now and help rebuild Christ's Church for the digital age, just as St. Francis rebuilt it with stones and wood." As Jonathan left the papal apartments, he carried with him not just sacred relics and documents, but a completely transformed understanding of his life's purpose. The cross of St. Francis would accompany him back to the set of The Chosen and beyond, serving as a constant reminder that his work was not just entertainment, but genuine ministry. Vatican officials began the quiet work of preparing announcements and coordinating with Catholic media organizations worldwide, knowing that they were about to introduce a revolutionary new model of evangelization. The Church that had once commissioned apostles to carry the gospel on foot across continents, was now commissioning an apostle to carry it across digital networks to billions of hearts in the months that followed. Jonathan completed filming the final season of The Chosen with a new depth and spiritual authority that was evident to everyone on set. His ordination as a permanent deacon took place in a beautiful ceremony at St. Peter's Basilica, attended by his fellow cast members and thousands of faithful who had been touched by his ministry. The new Pontifical Council for Digital Evangelization launched with unprecedented support from Catholic institutions worldwide, developing innovative approaches to proclaiming the gospel through film, television, social media, and emerging technologies. Jonathan's unique position as both ordained minister and media professional allowed him to bridge worlds that had rarely intersected, creating new pathways for grace to reach souls who might never encounter traditional forms of ministry. The impact of that extraordinary day in St. Peter's Square continued to ripple outward as The Chosen reached its conclusion and Jonathan's expanded ministry began to flourish. His example inspired countless other artists, actors, and media professionals to see their work as genuine vocations rather than merely careers, leading to a renaissance of faith-based content that maintained both artistic excellence and spiritual authenticity. The cross of St. Francis, now permanently housed in Jonathan's office at the Vatican's communications headquarters, continued to serve as a symbol of God's ability to use unexpected instruments for his greatest purposes. Religious leaders from around the world began to recognize that the future of evangelization lay not in competing with modern media, but in sanctifying it through the dedicated service of faithful believers. This remarkable story proves that God still works through ordinary people who say yes to extraordinary callings. Just as he did with the first apostles, Jonathan Roumie's journey from struggling actor to papal appointee shows us that our lives may be preparing us for purposes we can't yet imagine if we stay open to God's surprising plans. The cross of St. Francis, passed from one church rebuilder to another, challenges us to use our own gifts in service of the gospel in a world hungry for hope. Perhaps God is calling you to be a modern apostle in your own sphere of influence. What cross is God asking you to carry? And are you ready to say yes? If this story moved your heart, subscribe for more inspiring faith stories and comment below to share how God might be calling you to rebuild His church in your generation.